Welcome to the Cold Case Christianity broadcast, the only Christian case-making program hosted by a cold case homicide detective. J. Warner Wallace has been investigating cold case murders in Los Angeles County for over a decade. His work has been featured on Fox News, Court TV, and Dateline. For more information about Jim's work and the case for Christianity, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. Now, here's your host, J. Warner Wallace.
Thanks for joining us at Cold Case Christianity. I'm J. Warner Wallace. We're going to start a series right now on our show where we're going to answer some questions that are offered to us by you, the listeners of our podcast, and the viewers of our NRB TV show. Now, you might be wondering how you get a question submitted that we can actually consider to be answered here on the show, and I'll tell you how to do that right now. If you go to coldcasechristianity.com and you look on our homepage, you'll see there's a place there where you can sign up to subscribe to our daily email. And I'm going to accept questions that are sent to us by those of you who do subscribe on a daily basis. We have thousands of you who do that. And all you have to do to ask a question is hit reply on any one of your daily emails. You'll get 5 a week from me. And by the way, sometimes people will say, well, Jim, what if I don't want to receive like all 5? I might not be interested in everything you have to say on a daily basis. I get that. If you think that 5 emails a week are too much to get, and each one of these is going to present either something in writing or by video or by audio that will help you make the case for what you believe as a Christian. But 5 can be a bit much. If you think 5 is too much, here's what you do. On your program that handles your email, there's a button at the top of that program which says delete. Just delete the ones you don't want to read. But if you want to submit a question here at Cold Case Christianity, you'll have to hit reply to one of the daily emails to submit it. Now, I will do my best to get those questions answered here. But understand that it may be difficult to answer all of them. If I can, I'll send you a link to an article I've written, something like that kind of direct you on this. But we'll start collecting these. I'll do my best to answer as many as I can here on our broadcast. And so we'll try that, at least for now. I hope it will be helpful for you to be able to submit a question. Now today, the question I'm going to answer has been arriving in my email box in a variety of forms for the last week. Why? Because we happen to have suffered another national tragedy in a school shooting this week. Now, without naming where the school shooting took place or giving any publicity to who did the school shooting, it's just safe to say, I think, that we need to talk about this kind of gun violence as often as possible because it is no longer an anomaly. It is something we could talk about. I used to think, well, look, if you write or talk about that, that's really just a topical in the time frame in which this is important. And 6 months from now, no one's even going to probably be paying attention to that issue. But sadly, school shootings and other mass shootings have not become these topical anomalies. They are, in fact, evergreen. We are always going to be talking about these issues because, sadly, we continue to see them occur everywhere across the nation. So I'm going to answer an email I got that asks a question about how we should respond to such shootings. Now, I will say to you up front, that is kind of outside my box in terms of what I typically do on this show, which is to make a case for the reliability of Scripture, for the existence of God, for a more thoughtful, reasonable, evidential Christian faith. That's the kind of stuff we always talk about here. But I can see myself more and more in the future moving toward more of a cultural apologetics where we are trying to examine the events of our world through a Christian worldview, through a Christian lens. And that's really what this question is all about, as it came from a reader. So by the way, if you submit your questions, I will keep you anonymous. Don't worry, I will not use your name as we talk about these. Now here's the email I got from a listener of our podcast and who gets the Daily Mail. And here's what he says. He says, Jim, with all these school shootings, I have a question. What is the proper response that Christians should offer when people ask us about gun control and all the other things that come up when something like this happens? My friends on social media are fighting with one another, and I would like to know how to approach them. Since you have a law enforcement background, I thought you'd be the perfect one to ask. Okay, this is one of those hot topic issues, as we talked about a minute ago, and I do want to offer you a couple of things to think about. We'll do it in 3 segments here on today's show. This is the one question I will answer today. In the future, I will hopefully have briefer answers on a variety of topics that we can do more than one in an episode. But today we're just going to focus on this one because it is such an important issue. And I think we have to balance really a few questions that we have to be able to offer as Christians. I don't suggest that we get on social media and start interacting unless you're prepared to do it conscientiously. What typically happens is you get on social media and you think, somebody has offered some objection in 140 characters, and you want to be able to respond in 140 characters, but really the conscientious response rather is either going to be a conversation you're going to have with them, or a much more verbose. It's not going to be able to, you're not going to be able to get this in 140 characters. And if you're not ready to commit to more than 140 characters, I would suggest you don't start. That maybe you reach that person personally. We don't just take the bait and try to throw out a little sound bite on social media. So, as we talk about this issue of gun violence, I want to offer 3 things you have to balance in your mind as you think about how you're going to respond. 3 questions. The first one's largely practical. The second one is largely philosophical. The third one is largely theological. So you can kind of keep them in that box. And here is the first one. It's in the area of practical response. We're going to have to answer some questions about gun control. I mean, for those of you who are like me, look, I'm a police officer. I've carried weapons on duty. I continue to carry weapons off duty. This is a part of my life, and it has been for 30 years. When I was a kid, my dad was a police officer before me. This is really a part of the way I was raised. And I want people to remember that in America, at least, the culture is not such that we think we need to have guns to protect ourselves from one another. That's not how it started anyway. Now, many of you may feel that way today, but the rich, historic, constitutional tradition of gun ownership doesn't really have anything to do with protecting ourselves from each other. It's really about a concern about protecting ourselves from the government. Because if you think about those revolutionary times, it would have been far easier to subjugate an entire people on this side of the Atlantic if none of us were allowed to own weapons. If none of us could defend ourselves, we'd be run over. And if you think about the history of any totalitarian government in the history of mankind, those totalitarian governments would have been a lot harder to put in place had everyone in the system, had everyone in the country been armed and been able to band together to resist. Typically, gun ownership is a part of the American tradition because of a suspicion that we had, which was really, if you think about it, it is grounded in a Christian worldview. A worldview that says, look, I don't care what great political system you put in place, people are deeply, inherently rebellious and fallen by their nature, and we cannot trust each other even to govern each other. We just need to have this kind of ability to defend ourselves as a matter of checks and balances against what might be a hostile government at some point. So I can at least begin to understand and appreciate where the cultural tradition for America comes from. And that's important for us to begin to talk about. But we're going to have to enter into the rather dicey territory of gun control in the sense that we have to answer some big questions. By the way, I always look at this from the perspective of, in any crime I've investigated, it begins with the intent of the killer, through the actions of the murder, to the cover-up that occurs later, or what his actions were after. In other words, I always look at before, during, and after any event to assess what to do and how to respond. I think the same thing is true here. Before anyone owns a gun, we have to make sure we understand what the proper rules and vetting would be that would allow gun ownership. We don't want anyone to just grab onto a gun given maybe a violent background, a background of mental illness, any number of categories. Now, most of us and most of the states have these prohibitions in place, but where they aren't in place, or where there's a loophole that doesn't allow us to vet gun owners, we have to close those loopholes. I think that's fair, and most of us, even those who are in favor of gun ownership, would agree that, we cannot let people who we think are at risk, high-risk people, own guns. That's what we have to do before the fact. But then we have to think about, once you own the gun, are there responsibilities? What kinds of guns do we think are really necessary for self-defense, for home defense, for hunting, these kinds of things? Now look, I have heard arguments being made that an AR-15 is a great rifle to use as home defense. Okay, I get that. What we need to do is to be able to find and limit those weapons that are owned that will still do the job from a home defense perspective, but yet won't do the job on a mass murder perspective. And if a gun slips into one category where it could actually be used in that way, I think we have to realize, hey, there's alternatives for home ownership. There's alternatives for home protection. Let's go with those alternatives and to eliminate these guns that have become the popular weapons of mass destruction. Now, that's a controversial position to take. And I know a lot of my fellow law enforcement officers would say, you're going too far. Gun owners might say I'm going too far. But we have to strike a compromise. Remember, if you're going to cross a bridge to reach a point in the middle with each other, you're going to have to leave something behind at the edges. And this is one of those things we're probably going to have to leave behind if we're going to be adamant about you can just own any kind of gun. When we talk about automatic weapons, people sometimes will talk about semi-automatic weapons as though they're automatic because they don't understand the distinction. I think most of us would agree that fully automatic weapons need to be just the purview of our military, and homeowners don't need fully automatic weapons. So I think we have to kind of think about those issues. But there's another one. When we're talking about ownership of guns or gun control, I'm not really talking about it. I don't think about it in terms of, well, we should control how many guns are out there, but we should make sure that the people who own guns control them. So that aspect of gun control I'm actually in favor of. And what I mean by that is we have to make sure that the people who have guns are responsible. A lot of these shootings we're seeing are on the part of young people who are using their parents' weapons. Now let's think about it. If we had laws enacted in which we said you will not sell a gun to anyone without selling the locking device that goes with that gun that makes it very difficult for anyone to use the gun who's not an owner, we shouldn't be selling guns without locking devices. I mean, that's one way we could address this problem to begin with, but how do we know anyone will actually use the locks? Well, if you knew that you would be charged for whatever crime is committed with your gun should you not secure it, I think a lot of us would either, number one, really take great pains to secure our weapons, or we might think, this burden is too great for me and I'm not that interested in having a weapon. I think we would start to bridge this divide. So I'm really concerned about what is the vetting process for new owners, and two, what kinds of requirements can we put in place to make sure that people are controlling the guns that they own and not allowing them to be used by anyone other than them. And of course, finally, we have to talk about, well, what happens after the fact. And that will bring me, I think, to some of my other conclusions, some of the other positions I've taken that are more philosophical and more theological. And we'll talk about that right after the break. I remember as an atheist and examining the Gospels for the first time. Didn't own a Bible, but I went out and bought one because a pastor intrigued me by saying that Jesus was the smartest person who'd ever lived. And I thought, well, okay, I want to take a look and see if that's true. And I was just mining out the wisdom statements of Jesus. But as I got through the Gospels, I realized that the people who wrote those Gospels wanted me to believe this stuff actually happened. They wrote them as if either they were there or they talked to somebody who was there. But of course, there were variations in the accounts. Many people would have called those contradictions in the accounts. I never for once, though, flinched as a non-believer reading those accounts and seeing all the alleged contradictions between that never bothered. As a matter of fact, it had just the opposite effect for me, because by the time I started reading those, I'd been working in investigations probably 5 or 6 years, and I had interviewed thousands of witnesses, all who claimed to see the same event. And never in any of my casework had I ever experienced eyewitnesses who claim the exact same thing. As a matter of fact, defense attorneys love this because when they finally get you in front of a jury, they're going to exploit the alleged differences between the accounts. You can't trust any of these people. Their accounts aren't exactly the same. That's always the way it is in criminal investigations. No two eyewitnesses will ever report the same event the same way. And sometimes you're scratching your head thinking, really? Were these two people even at the same event? Well, of course they were, but they bring to the event their own set of experiences, their own interests, their passions. Maybe they're standing in a different geographic location when the crime occurred. But if nothing else, if they're interested in clothing, they're far more likely to pin on the clothing. If they're interested in what that one guy said, they may not even mention the other people who were there. There are lots of reasons why these accounts never line up perfectly. But that's what my job is as the detective, is to put those pieces of the puzzle together until I have a complete, robust account that includes everyone's statement. If I saw 4 accounts from an eyewitness that lined up perfectly, I would say there's something going wrong. The first thing I say as a detective when I respond to crime scenes, I ask the dispatcher, do we have officers on the scene? Yeah. Separate the eyewitnesses. Why do I say that? Because I want to get there and get 4 apparently contradictory accounts that I can puzzle together. I don't want them talking to each other. I don't want them to line up their stories, because true eyewitness testimony looks and feels just like the 4 accounts in the Gospels. Okay, this second aspect of the response, how do I respond as a Christian to the issues related to gun violence, I think is another area we have to balance. Now, when I say we're taking three aspects here, practical, philosophical, theological, and we're trying to balance those together, what I mean is the discussions you're seeing on social media typically are focused on one of those three things. If it's a gun control issue, they're focused on gun control, and they're not even trying to balance other issues. All of these things have to be held in tension and in balance with one another. That's going to be important for us to think about. Here's the second one, and it is more philosophical. It's whatever our philosophy as a culture is related to mental illness. It's about answering some questions related to mental illness. Here's what I mean by that. A lot of what we're seeing in terms of gun violence, if you read the reports afterwards, you will see that these folks who committed these acts, for the most part, the vast majority, showed some sign of mental illness prior. And you might wonder why, for example, it seems like over and over again you'll see reports after a mass shooting in which it says the police had contact with him. They were at his house 25 times prior to this crime. He was known to authorities. You'll hear that kind of language all the time. Well, it kind of sounds like our authorities are doing a really poor job, doesn't it, of protecting us? Because apparently these people are known to authorities, yet they still commit these crimes. Well, why is that the case? It's the case because we are at a quandary about what to do with people who we think are mentally ill. Now, I want you to think about that for a second. I know as a police officer how this works. If somebody is a threat to themselves or others, this is a classification in our state called 5150 WC, Health and Welfare. This is really about how do we demonstrate that somebody is a danger to themselves or to others in such a way that we can commit them to health services. And by the way, if we committed them to health services, what are we really talking about? For the most part, we're talking about a 72-hour hold. In other words, if somebody calls us as a police agency and says, hey, we've got a guy over here and he's acting crazy, and they can articulate ways in which he's acting crazy. Well, we're going to go out there and see if those articulated factors are actually true, because we just don't want to put anyone in a 5150 lockdown. But even if we decided, yeah, you're right, all these things are dangerously risky, and he seems to be, not mentally well, we're going to take him for an evaluation. That evaluation, for the most part, will put him back on the street sooner than you or I would like. Why? Because we don't have a way to house the mentally ill. And if you think, are there places where the mentally ill are housed? Yes. But can we house everyone who's mentally ill? No, we can't. Now, we do have a system in place to house those who eventually will commit a crime. Those are called jails. And we do have those. But here in California, for example, we have opened up our jails in order to ease overcrowding. And so even we've reduced what the crimes are. Look, as police officers, we are not in place to deal with crazy. We're in place to deal with criminal. We take people who commit crimes, and there is a place in our society for people who commit crimes. But it turns out there is not as well developed a place for those people who are just crazy. And so that's why you'll see over and over again that this guy was on, people knew about him. Well, yeah, what can we do about it? We don't have a response that is adequate to the problem. And that's why you will almost always, after the fact, hear, yeah, you know what? The authorities were aware of that guy. Unfortunately, there wasn't a place to house that guy, so eventually he committed a crime. It is a balance, though, between does he have access to the weapons and is he being housed? If he's not being housed and he has complete unrestricted access to weapons, well, you get a problem. If we can correct the problem by doing one of two things. Make sure that he has no access to weapons. Doesn't mean you have to eliminate weapons. It means you have to make sure those weapons are controlled by the owners properly. And he should not be an owner if he's been properly vetted, so he wouldn't be one of the owners. He'd be somebody getting that gun from somebody else. Or two, house those people who are mentally ill and who have apparently been showing you this over the course of several years, because you've had law enforcement responding to them, you've had mental health officials talking about them, you've got episodes in the most recent shooting where he's doing things on social media that demonstrate he's a risk to himself and others, yet it seems that there's no system in place to house the mentally ill. So you're not going to solve this problem, and you're not even going to be able to talk about it intelligently unless you first address those two issues and find a way to balance those two issues, the issues of gun control and mental health, mental illness. So let's go take another quick break. When we come back, I'll give you the last piece of this, which is entirely theological.
Be sure to visit the Cold Case Christianity website daily to read Jim's blog, watch the weekly video, or listen to the Cold Case Christianity podcast. You'll also find great free resources, including the free downloadable monthly Bible insert. While you're there, be sure to sign up for Jim's daily Case Notes email. Cold Case Christianity is designed to help you become a better Christian casemaker. In addition to Jim's daily blog and weekly podcasts and videos, Jim continues to write books designed to help you become a better Christian casemaker. At coldcasechristianity.com, you'll find a link to Cold Case Christianity, God's Crime Scene, Forensic Faith, and Alive. These resources will help you defend what you believe and share it with others. And if you want to help your kids become Christian casemakers, be sure to check out the kids' versions of Jay Warner's books.
Okay, so now here's the third piece of the puzzle that I see in trying to respond as a Christian to the issue of gun violence. And when we see it, and you're going to see it in every form, we've seen it in Las Vegas, we've seen it in schools, we see it all the time. I think there are three responses, three areas in which we need to be ready to give an answer. And those three areas are either practical, the issues related to gun control, they're philosophical, what is our philosophy as a culture related to mental illness, and finally they are going to be theological. And that's what I want to talk about right now, are the theological issues. That's the third component. And that's simply this. We're going to have to answer some questions about God's sovereignty. And I only say that because after these shootings, I'm like you. I'm on social media platforms and I'm listening and watching and reading all the responses from all kinds of people. And what I see on one side, on the part of believers, is they'll say, well, you know, if we hadn't taken God out of the schools, this wouldn't be happening. If we hadn't become such a godless country, this wouldn't be happening. And I don't think that's actually the case, especially if so many of these shooters are mentally ill. Do you think somehow that if they were believers, there are, by the way, mentally ill believers. Sometimes these conditions are caused by any number of things, and you cannot say that if prayer was back in school, we would not have this problem. I think we might still have this problem. But on the other side of the issue, I will hear non-believers say, well, where's your God? If there was a God, this is just more evidence that there is no God, because the most vulnerable of us in culture, kids, are the victims of these crimes. Certainly, if there is an all-loving, all-powerful God, He would not have allowed this to happen. So here's what I see on both sides of the issue. I see kind of blanket, Twitter-worthy statements made in 140 characters that either argue that the culture has become godless or that the event proves there is no God. And I think we need to be able to kind of answer both of those. We need to be, as number one, we have to have a clear idea of what we mean or what we think about the nature of God and what we mean when we describe something as evil. We've talked about that before on this show. I think we have to be able to help people see that even if there is an all-loving, all-powerful God, there are 6, 7 reasons why He might allow what appears to be a horrific event occur. And I've talked about this at great lengths in an entire chapter in God's Crime Scene. And I'm not here to try to promote that work to you right now, but I will tell you this, that it is a cumulative case of about 7 things that I think are behind any murder I've ever worked and investigated, and are behind any school shooting. 7 factors you've got to consider as to how and why an all-powerful, all-loving God would allow this to occur. And the most, I think, powerful for me was when it dawned on me that under a Christian worldview, we are not temporal creatures that live just 90 years. And this seems incredibly evil when a young person's life is ended early. But that's an atheistic worldview. Because atheism sees life as a line segment, right? From birth to death, 90 years. If you cut off the last 60 or the last 70 because you kill a 10 or a 20-year-old, it seems incredibly evil, right? But if the Christian worldview is true, we are eternal creatures. Yeah, we live for 90 years on this side of the grave, but then we live for eternity. We're not a line segment, we're a ray. And if that's the case, then no matter what happens in the 90 years we live in here on earth, as we live in eternity with God, those 90 years seem like they're less and less and less and less relative to eternity. When you're 1,000 years in eternity, The 90 years that you spent here on earth, when you're a million years into eternity, the 90 years, these will seem like millisecond events, regardless of how evil they are. What I don't want to see us do is respond either ourselves by being shattered by these kinds of events, where we start to doubt God's goodness or God's existence, because we've got lots of good reasons. And by the way, this is why it's so important to examine the evidence that might explain evil. It's important because it doesn't help after the fact. It's hard to catch up. It's hard to respond after the fact intellectually when this seems like an entirely emotional moment. It's far easier to think about these things through intellectually first, then it'll change the way you emotionally respond to them when they occur. And by the way, as an officer, I have seen more death and destruction and mayhem than probably most of you watching this right now. Yet I've been able to keep my head in place because I thought these things through prior to having to deal with them. And I think it's important for us to do the same thing. Just to encourage you, there's an entire section for free, downloadable as PDF files on our website under the writing section at coldcasechristianity.com. Just touch that tab. You'll see an entire section there for the problem of evil. Read those articles, download those articles. They will help you and they don't cost anything. So we want people to be able to respond to these entirely theological issues, which are how do we reconcile these kinds of events with an all-loving, all-powerful God. They can be reconciled, but it's going to take us some time, I think, to really work through that. Today I'm just going to offer the one thing. I think eternity has to be kept in mind. And by the way, if you wanted a world in which love was possible, you would have to it's a frightening thing, but you would have to allow a world in which the free agency available for evil is also in play. You think God's all loving, and He's going to create a world where love is possible, but that world also means it's got to be possible to hate, to kill, to do things that are not right. Now, what an unloving God would simply not tell you how to use that dangerous thing called free will, that dangerous thing called free agency. That's not what our God has done. He didn't throw the knife at us and then not even tell us how to catch it by the handle or by the blade. Instead, He gave us the scary, dangerous thing that makes love possible, free agency, and He gave us a set of instructions so we would not abuse it. Now, don't get me wrong, a lot of people won't read the instruction book, but that's not on God. So I think we have to kind of be able to think these things through clearly, practically, philosophically, and theologically. And I hope that long answer helps you process gun violence as we see it each day as Christians. Thanks for listening to that response, and I'll join you back here next week at Cold Case Christianity.
Thanks for joining us at the Cold Case Christianity broadcast. If you're interested in more information about this week's topic, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. For a thorough investigation of the reliability of the New Testament Gospels and the case for Christianity, be sure to purchase Cold Case Christianity, God's Crime Scene, Forensic Faith, and Alive.